So let's look at the economics of where we are with some of the announcements by the big or the major parties. As you've heard, the Greens and the ALP have announced subsidising batteries for people with solar power. The Coalition, for their part, has announced reserving gas from the gas giants to lower the cost of electricity. How do the figures look? How do the mathematics look? You can fib, lie or obfuscate about your policy, but you can't lie about the maths. Maths don't lie. So let's go to Leith Van Onselen. He's a former Commonwealth Treasury economist. These days he's at macrobusiness.com. He's chief economist at the MB Fund. Leith Van Onselen, I spoke to him earlier this morning and I asked him about the $2.3 billion to subsidise people with solar power. How does it look?
I think it's pretty poor policy, to be quite frank, Steve. It's basically reverse Robin Hood. So Australian taxpayers are going to spend a lot of money to subsidise wealthier people who are the ones who can afford the solar and who can afford the batteries. And the overall electricity grid is still going to need to be run. It's going to need to be maintained. It's going to need to be built out for all these renewables that the government wants to build. And those costs will end up being deferred more onto, people who can't afford the batteries and can't afford the solar.
Now, why is it, it's a subsidy. Why won't it mean that poor people or working class people won't be able to afford a battery system for their solar unit if they have solar?
Yeah, they still won't be able to afford it because the upfront cost to a battery, even with the subsidies, is massive, and the payback period is, years. So, not too many people in Australia have bucket loads of, spare cash sitting around which they can pump into a solar system and gradually get the savings back over, a decade.
How then do you feel about electric vehicles? Because for a couple of years now, the same thing's been happening for EVs, where the taxpayer has been subsidising the purchase of electric vehicles over a certain price.
I think it's absolutely appalling policy, to be quite frank. Again, it's reverse Robin Hood. Taxpayers should not be subsidising car purchases for anybody, and especially not EVs, which also do not pay for their road use. So if you drive an internal combustion vehicle, a traditional vehicle, you pay over 50 cents in fuel excise. So you are paying to use the road. You're also paying for your pollution that you create. If you purchase an electric vehicle, not only are you getting handouts up front from state and federal governments and through their fringe benefit tax, etc., you're also not paying for road use. And it's effectively a subsidy for those people who can afford EVs, who tend to be much higher income earners. I think it's appalling policy.
How do you feel then about the Coalition's announced policy of reducing the fuel excise for 12 months by 50% then?
Oh, look, I'm pretty lukewarm, and I honestly don't think we should be narrowing the tax base. So the tax base is incredibly reliant on personal income taxes, and one of the areas where we've actually broadened the tax base is through fuel excise. But at the same time, I'm pretty agnostic on it. It's only a 1 year cut. It's not a permanent cut. So it's not going to narrow the tax base over the long term. But it does highlight a bigger problem we've got in that we're basically excluding one segment of the driving population, i.e. those with, battery electric vehicles from paying for their road use.
My guest is Leith Van Onselen. He's with Macroeconomics. This is 612 ABC Brisbane. Macro Business. Leith Van Onselen, then how do you feel about the announced tariff regime by the United States? What do you think will be the effect on Australia? I've had some people suggest to me that it'll mean that countries like China will dump or will send their EVs, cheaper EVs, to Australia, which will actually have the effect of lowering our inflation situation. Can you address that?
Yeah, certainly. So look, my view on the tariffs is I don't feel too positive about them. They're very ad hoc the way they've applied them. So effectively, the US government has basically worked out countries where it has the biggest trade deficit with. It's going to slap on the highest tariffs. Those with where it runs a trade surplus like Australia, it's going to slap on a 10% tariff. It's very ad hoc. It's not particularly well structured, but the impact on Australians is positive and negative. So on the negative side, I'll start with those first. Obviously, just about every Australian has superannuation savings, and those are taking a hammering because financial markets have been hammered, both here and abroad. So that's obviously negative. But on the positive side, as you just mentioned, Australians should receive cheaper imported goods. And the reason for that is, China's, for example, has been hit with a 34% tariff from the United States. And what that means is that China's likely to sell a lot less goods into the US, which is the world's biggest consumer market. And as a result, it's going to be left with surplus goods and all more likely to dump those in Australia and other countries. And what that should actually do is lower imported inflation, which is obviously good for the RBA who's trying to cut inflation. The RBA is also likely to cut rates harder, not just for that reason, but also because global economic growth is likely to slow. Growth in Australia, therefore, is likely to slow. The impact here from the tariff isn't much directly because it's only a 10% tariff. We only sell 4% of our exports to the US. The bigger impact is on our trading partners. So Australia's three biggest export markets, number one, China, number two, Japan, number three, Korea, and that they all have tariffs of about a quarter to a third. And if they sell, if they obviously sell less goods into America, they're going to demand less iron ore, less coal, less energy, those sorts of things from Australia. So there are second-round impacts on the economy, and the RBA is likely to take the lower inflation from the imports, as well as the lower growth profile and the rout in the financial markets as an excuse to cut interest rates harder. And now financial markets are tipping 4 more rate cuts this year as a result of the tariffs.
Wow. Well, won't that mean it's easier to buy or to get a mortgage or to buy a house?
Absolutely. So obviously, if you're a mortgage holder, this is a big positive because it means that you'll have lower interest rates. You won't have to spend as much on your mortgage payments. Now, this depends on what your view is. I think it's a negative, but it's likely to the Trump tariffs and lower interest rates are likely to, create another house price boom. So whenever the RBA cuts interest rates, fairly heavily, it results in a spike in house prices. And I'm a little bit biased here. I've got 2 teenage children, so I don't really want to see house prices rocket even more because it's going to make it harder for them when it's their turn.
Yep.
But this is another consequence. So if you want to see your house value go up, you'll see that as a positive. If you're like me and you think Australian housing is already too expensive, you'll see it as a negative.
My guest is Leith Van Onselen from macrobusiness.com.au. Well, on housing then, the Coalition has announced they would temporarily cut international student numbers for a period of time to ease pressure on the Australian housing market. How do you see that, Leith?
I think it should be a permanent cut, and I think it should be a lot harder, to be quite frank, Steve. So Australia has the highest concentration of international students in the world, bar none, far higher than any other advanced nation by a long shot. We have about 1.1 million. Well, we had 1.1 million students and international students enrolled in Australia at the end of last year. So we have extreme numbers of foreign students, and unfortunately, I don't think it's actually had a negative impact, not just on the rental market, but also on teaching standards at our universities. We've seen, the rise. We've seen massive cheating scandals. We've seen the rise of group assignments in Melbourne University, where I'm from, which is actually the university I went to. We've seen tutoring held fully in Mandarin, which is obviously very bad if you're a local student. So I think the numbers need to come down significantly. But the way the Coalition should do it is by increasing standards. And the way you increase standards is you significantly increase English language requirements. You increase entrance exams so that we only get very good students coming in. You shut down the dodgy ghost colleges in the vocational education space, which are basically visa factories. They're designed to bring people in as under the mask of being a student when they're really just here to work. You shut those sorts of things down. You should also increase financial requirements. So instead of just showing that, showing a copy of a bank statement saying you've got money, you actually have to put money into an escrow account so that you can fund yourselves when you're here. And the government should also cut back on work rights. So for some silly reason, after the pandemic, we're now allowing students to work 24 hours a week while they study, whereas before the pandemic, it was 20 hours a week. I think it should be more like 10. They should be here to study, not to work. And if you do those sorts of things, you'll get a much higher quality student, much lower numbers, but the average quality of student we get here will be much higher. And then if they end up staying as a permanent resident, they'll likely be far more skilled than they would be otherwise, and we'd have lower numbers of a higher quality system. And I think that's what we should aim for.
So I have to ask you, given we're in a federal election campaign, and I've asked you about both sides of the political spectrum's policies, how do you feel about what's being presented to the Australian people in the first week and a bit of the federal election campaign from both sides, Leith Van Onselen?
Yeah, look. To me, I always find politics pretty lackluster. But look, I'll be honest with you, Peter Dutton does have, the coalition does have one excellent policy. So I obviously support his immigration cuts, but they're pretty weak, let's be honest. But the one policy that is a game changer for me is this gas reservation policy. So I've discussed it previously that East Coast Australia is the only exporting jurisdiction in the world that exports a lot of gas, but we don't have any requirement to supply Australians first. And as a result, we are facing East Coast gas shortages, and there are plans to start importing gas, which is absurd. Towards the end of the year into next year, and once we do that, our gas prices domestically are going to rocket because we're going to start paying the import parity price. So at the moment, East Coast Australia pays about $12 a gigajoule for our gas, which is absurdly high. And once we start importing gas, that'll go to $20 roughly. And what that means is it means that our manufacturers have to pay more for gas if they run, blast furnaces, that sort of thing. But also means that our electricity prices will rise because gas is one of the things that sets our electricity price. And we want to avoid that at all costs. And Peter Dutton has a gas reservation policy whereby he wants to divert uncontracted gas, force it into the domestic market to bring down prices. And it's a policy that we should have had 10 years ago, to be quite frank. And it will help to lower gas prices and therefore lower electricity prices. And it's something that Australia desperately needs.
I'll leave it there. Leith Van Onselen, thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Anytime.
Leith Van Onselen, former Commonwealth Treasury economist, these days chief economist at MB Fund and macrobusiness.com.au.